All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore how 19th century India woke up from a period of deep social stagnation and basically sparked a revolutionary fight for human rights and equality. We're looking at a time when a static society was suddenly jolted awake, and it led to this absolutely monumental shift in how people viewed human dignity, religion, and really the whole structure of their world.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with a society ripe for reform, then move into the ideological awakening. After that, two streams of reform, followed by the fight for women, and finally, we'll wrap up with legislative and educational triumphs.
Okay, part 1. A society ripe for reform. The vicious web of the 19th century.
We really have to start by establishing the dark status quo of the era. The arrival of this enlightened, science-driven British colonial presence actually forced Indian society to hold a mirror up to its own decaying institutions. On one side, you've got 18th century Europe, entirely driven by science and a scientific outlook. But on the other, a stagnant 19th century India, steeped in magic, superstition, and an overwhelming priestly monopoly over scriptural knowledge. This colonial intrusion effectively forced Indian society to ask a really tough question. How exactly did a handful of foreigners manage to colonize such a vast country? Well, the answer lay in the weaknesses within their own social structure. Just imagine a stagnant society caught in a vicious web of religious superstitions and rigid caste segregation. It was a place where social mobility was completely checked, and individual initiative was basically thwarted at every turn.
Now, the conditions for women in this social structure were profoundly depressing. They were trapped by horrific practices. We're talking female infanticide, prevalent polygamy, and kulinism, which was this practice in Bengal where even very old men took very young girls as wives. Honestly, women were generally accorded a shockingly low status and possessed essentially no identity of their own.
But somehow, it actually gets worse. If a woman somehow escaped those early miseries and outlived her husband, she was often expected to commit sati. That was the brutal social coercion of a widow burning on her husband's funeral pyre. Reformer Raja Rammohan Roy forcefully condemned this practice. He boldly called it exactly what it was, saying it's a murder according to every shastra. He was hitting the nail on the head, pointing out that true religion did not actually sanction this horror.
Moving on to part 2, the ideological awakening, the rise of the enlightened middle class.
So this is where the profound intellectual pushback really begins. The heroes of this awakening, the new intelligentsia, they weren't wealthy industrialists. Ironically, their roots actually lay in government service, law, education, journalism, and medicine. Why? Because trade and industry were firmly under British control. So instead of wealth, they modeled themselves after the European middle class and massive movements like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Armed with rationalism, religious universalism, and humanism, they used their Western education to forge a completely alternative cultural and ideological system.
To evaluate their own traditions, they completely replaced blind faith with reason. And this is perfectly captured by Akshay Kumar Dutt right here when he said, "Rationalism is our only preceptor." They didn't just blindly accept old dogmas anymore. They analyzed natural and social phenomena. Dutt even brought in medical opinion to support his views and fight against the physical harms of child marriage. I mean, think about that for a second. They literally had to use doctors to prove that marrying off children was physically harmful. They were bringing logic and science straight to the battlefield of tradition.
All right, part 3, two streams of reform, fighting the status quo.
With their new philosophies firmly established, these reformers had to figure out tactically how to challenge social ills that derived almost all their legitimacy from religion. So they essentially split into two broad camps. On one side, we have the reformist movements, like the Brahmo Samaj, Prarthana Samaj, and the Aligarh movement. They relied heavily on reason and conscience to reform their religion to meet modern needs. On the other side, we have the revivalist movements, like the Arya Samaj and the Deoband movement, which appealed more to the lost, ancient purity of their religion. Both of these streams desperately wanted change, for sure, but they differed in how much they relied on modern logic versus, looking backward to an uncorrupted ancient tradition.
But here's the real question. How did they get everyday people to actually listen? Well, they were incredibly media savvy. They didn't just stand around arguing in high society English. They used vernacular languages, novels, dramas, poetry, the press, and eventually even cinema starting in the 1930s. They used every single communication tool at their disposal to pull these debates out of the elite upper-class circles and inject them directly into the minds of the broader masses.
Next up is part 4, the fight for women, dismantling the patriarchy.
A massive focus of this awakening, really the very heart of their agenda, was liberating women from total subjugation. Across the board, whether Hindu or Muslim, women were wholly dependent on male relatives for their economic survival. Just look at this. Hindu women had absolutely no right to inherit property or terminate an undesirable marriage. Muslim women faced extreme inequality in divorce and could inherit only half as much as men. Plus, polygamy was prevalent in both communities. They completely lacked basic economic independence and legal identity. The reformers knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that without a radical change in the domestic sphere, where the initial socialization of the individual takes place, broader societal progress was simply impossible.
And that brings us to Part 5, Legislative and Educational Triumphs, Millimeter by Millimeter. Let's see how these philosophical arguments actually transformed into concrete action. Step by step, the reformers relentlessly pushed the government to enact favorable laws to physically protect women. Step 1. In 1795 and 1804, Bengal regulations officially declared female infanticide illegal. Step 2. Influenced heavily by Raja Rammohan Roy, the horrific practice of sati was declared illegal and culpable homicide in Bengal in 1829 and extended in 1830. And Step 3. To actually enforce those infanticide bans, an 1870 act made registering the birth of all babies compulsory to actively verify female survival in areas where the custom was practiced in secret. It was a literal fight for physical survival from birth all the way through widowhood.
Now, beyond survival, there was a monumental push for widow remarriage, and reformers like Professor D.K. Carve showed just unbelievable personal dedication. He didn't just write essays or talk the talk, he literally lived the change he was advocating for by marrying a widow himself in 1893. He even opened a widow's home in Pune to provide high-caste widows with vocational training. He gave them a real purpose, a trade, and an interest in life.
As you'll see here, structural reform takes an agonizing amount of time. The fight against child marriage required over a century of constant, unrelenting legislative pressure to legally protect children from forced early marriages. It starts with the Native Marriage Act in 1872, moves to the Age of Consent Act in 1891, which forbade marriage for girls under 12. Then comes the Sardada Act in 1930, raising the age to 14 for girls and 18 for boys. And that stretches all the way to 1978 in free India with the Child Marriage Restraint Act. That's a long haul.
35. Yeah, 35. That is the staggering number of girls' schools in Bengal that the pioneer pundit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was personally associated with. After securing legal protections, education was absolutely the next great frontier for these reformers. By systematically dismantling barriers to education and health over the decades, they paved the way for self-confident women to eventually lead the movement themselves. We see this progression from the Calcutta Female Juvenile Society set up by missionaries in 1819 to the Bethune School founded in 1849, then the opening of Dufferin Hospitals for Women's Health in the 1880s, right up to the Indian Women's University and Lady Hardinge's Medical College opening in 1916. They were literally building the infrastructure of modern empowerment. And so, what was the ultimate result of all this? Well, the establishment of the All India Women's Conference in 1927 and the incredible rise of leaders like Sarojini Naidu. Her ascent to president of the Indian National Congress in 1925 and later becoming governor of the United Provinces proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the seeds of reform planted in the 19th century had finally beautifully bloomed. Women were no longer just the passive subjects of reform, They were the powerful leaders driving the whole shebang forward.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to stir your own inner reformer. Knowing how intensely our ancestors fought to dismantle the completely normal superstitions and accepted rules of the 19th century, what rigid social norms of today will the reformers of tomorrow look back on in total disbelief? It's a pretty powerful reminder that the fight for human dignity is a continuous journey. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating history with us.